Most people can name autism or ADHD when they hear the word neurodivergent. But what about the experiences that people live with every single day without having a name for them? What about the things that get dismissed as being bad at math, reading, or writing, too sensitive, too lazy, or just overreacting, when in reality, they're not personality flaws at all. They're differences in how the brain works. And the hardest part is that a lot of people don't even realize there's a reason behind what they're experiencing. So today we're not just talking about lesser known neurodivergent identities. We're talking about the experiences people have before they have the language to explain them. Hello, and welcome back to Minds That Think Differently. I am your host, Amanda. To start, I'll give a brief visual description of myself. I'm 16, white, have brown shoulder-length hair, and today I'm wearing a white and blue striped tank top. And today we are going to be talking about some of the lesser known neurodivergent identities. I don't have lived experience with most of these conditions. At least, I'm not diagnosed with any of these. So in order to do a full in-depth episode on many of these conditions, I would like to have either experts or those with lived experience. Therefore, this episode will just be an intro into these identities, and we will also do some myth busting. I did extensively research all of these conditions, but due to the lack of research and statistics about them, I can't give statistics and ensure that they are fully accurate in this episode, but many of these conditions have a higher prevalence than most people would think. I want to start out with what I mean by lesser known. Lesser known does not mean rarer. It means that it is often undiagnosed, misunderstood, or ignored, often due to gender bias, masking, lack of education, and overlap with other conditions. And once you start realizing how many people go unnoticed or misunderstood, it really changes how you see things. You start to question how many people were labeled instead of supported. Some of the things I'll talk about today are widely recognized as neurodivergent conditions, while others are differences in how the brain works that may or may not have formal diagnoses, but are still important to understand. Let's start out with the mailbox segment. So the question I will be addressing in this episode is, why have I never heard of these before if they affect so many people? This is such an important question, and honestly, it cuts to the core of the episode. The reason you haven't heard of many of these isn't because they're rare. It's because of how awareness and diagnosis systems have been built. For a long time, research around neurodivergence focused on very specific presentations, usually young boys, usually very visible traits. That meant anything that didn't match that picture was overlooked, misdiagnosed, or completely ignored. There's also the issue of masking. A lot of people with these identities learn to hide their struggles or adapt in ways that make things look fine from the outside, but internally it can be exhausting. Another reason is labeling without understanding. Instead of recognizing something like dysgraphia or auditory processing disorder, people might just be called lazy, bad at writing, or inattentive. So the experience is there, but the language isn't. And that language matters, because if you don't have the words to describe something, it becomes so much harder to recognize it in yourself or advocate for support. There's also a lack of research on formal recognition. Some of these things I will talk about in this episode aren't even an official diagnosis in manuals like the DSM-5. That doesn't mean they aren't real. It just means the system hasn't caught up yet. So if you're hearing some of these for the first time, you're not behind. You weren't taught. And that's exactly why this episode exists, to give you that language that you should have had a long time ago. I'm going to start out with synesthesia. Synesthesia is when the brain forms consistent connections between senses. So instead of your senses working separately, they overlap. If areas of the brain that process taste and sound both activate at the same time, instead of just taste or just sound, then you may end up tasting sounds instead of just hearing them. This can happen with many different things like tasting colors or seeing sounds. There are many different types of synesthesia. I will have a full episode covering all of these, but the easiest to understand is grapheme color synesthesia. This is where numbers are always associated with certain colors, like A always being red, or 3 always being yellow. Now, I want to make an important distinction here. A lot of people have associations, like thinking of math as blue or English as red. That's not the same thing. With synesthesia, it's automatic, consistent, and not something you choose. It just happens. Imagine going your whole life thinking everyone experiences the world this way, and then finding out they don't. That's actually really common with synesthesia. The experiences can be positive, negative, or neutral. Some people with synesthesia describe it as a gift because they are able to see or hear things others can't, and creative types often thrive, and having synesthesia can even help with memory recall. While for others, it can impair focus and interfere with their daily life, leading to sensory overload. Synesthesia is commonly co-occurring with other forms of neurodivergence. Imagine reading a book where every letter has a color. Not sometimes, but every single time consistently. Or hearing music and automatically seeing shapes or movement in your mind, like your senses are blending together without you choosing it. Synesthesia is considered lesser known, mostly because of underreporting. Many people don't realize they have it, or they don't see it as something unusual enough to bring up. There also isn't a single standardized medical test for it, so it often goes unrecognized. Next, I will be talking about aphantasia, which is almost the opposite of synesthesia, and this is something that I personally experience. Aphantasia is where your brain doesn't form mental images as part of thinking or imagination. So when someone says picture a beach, you might just think of the concept of a beach instead of actually seeing one in your mind. Some people with aphantasia have very faint or blurry mental imagery, while some, such as myself, can't see anything at all. When I think about a forest or my house, I can think of the concept in my head, but I don't see any image at all. And I want to pause here for a moment, because if you don't experience this, it can be really hard to understand. And if you do, you might have spent years not realizing it was different. For me, I always knew I couldn't visualize things, but I didn't have the language for it. In school, things like guided imagery or visualization exercises were really challenging, and I didn't fully understand why. Aphantasia is less known about just because there's a lot less research on this topic, and due to underreporting, because just like synesthesia, you can go your whole life without even knowing you have this. Experiences vary a lot. Some people with aphantasia report differences in memory, navigation, or recognizing faces, but experiences vary widely. One thing people struggle with is not being able to picture loved ones, which can be emotionally difficult. There's also a misconception that people with aphantasia can't dream, which isn't always true. For me personally, my dreams are visual, but once I wake up, that imagery is completely gone. Before we continue, take a second to check in with yourself. We've covered a lot already, and some of this might be hitting close to home. If you need to pause, that's completely okay. Next, I'll be talking about Tourette syndrome, which is probably the most known out of all the ones I will talk about in this episode, but I still wanted to cover it because a lot of people don't know what it is. But before I explain what it is, I want you to imagine something for a second. Imagine sitting in a quiet room, maybe a classroom or a meeting, somewhere where you're expected to sit still and stay focused, and you feel this urge building. At first, it's small and easy to ignore, but the longer you hold it in, the stronger it gets. It's not just a thought. It's a physical pressure building in your body that needs to be released, and eventually you can't ignore it anymore. That's what tics feel like for many people. Everyone with Tourette syndrome experiences tics differently, though, which is also something important to understand. Some people don't get a premonitory urge when they tic, and some people do. Another thing that's important to understand is that people with Tourette's don't know what their tics will be until they happen. Tourette syndrome is a neurological condition that involves tics, which are involuntary movements or vocal sounds. Tics can change over time, and tics are involuntary, although some people can temporarily suppress them, often at the cost of discomfort or increased urges later. Movement tics can include things like rapid blinking, shoulder shrugging, and vocal tics can include throat clearing, sniffing, grunting, or barking. These are not the only tics, by far, just some examples. Tics could even be small things that people can barely notice, like blinking or muscle clenching. So remember that Tourette's presents differently in every person that has it. Let's pause here for a second, because one of the biggest misconceptions is that tics are fully controllable, but they're not. Tics are involuntary. For many people, it feels like a buildup that has to be released. Tics can also be triggered or made worse by anxiety, stress, or even excitement. From the outside, it might look like something controllable, but internally, it's not. Another important clarification is that not all tics mean Tourette syndrome. To meet the criteria for Tourette syndrome, you must have multiple motor tics and at least one vocal tic at some point in time, and these tics have to last longer than a year. There are also other tic disorders. Provisional tic disorder, which is also known as transient tic disorder, is where you have motor and/or vocal tics for less than 1 year. It affects up to 10% of children in their school years. Tics have to begin before 18 years of age. Persistent or chronic tic disorder is where you have motor or vocal tics, but not both for more than 1 year. Persistent tic disorder affects less than 1% of school-aged children. The tics also have to begin before 18 years of age. And this is where misunderstanding really shows up. A lot of people think that Tourette's always involves swearing. This is known as coprolalia, but only 10 to 30% of people with Tourette's have coprolalia, meaning the majority of people with Tourette's do not have swearing tics. So when the media only focuses on those tics, it creates a really inaccurate picture. Some people with Tourette's may experience echolalia, which is repeated words or phrases said by yourself or others as a vocal tic. Living with Tourette's or tics can be very debilitating since they are uncontrollable and very misunderstood. There's a lot of social stigma surrounding Tourette syndrome, and although there are some media representations of Tourette syndrome, sometimes they end up contributing to the stigma instead of lessening it. What matters more than the criteria is the experience. Trying to manage something you can't fully control while also dealing with how other people react to it. People staring, people misunderstanding, people assuming it's intentional, and that can lead to a lot of frustration, embarrassment, and stigma. Tourette's is one of the more recognized conditions on this list, but even with that recognition, it's still widely misunderstood. And that misunderstanding often comes from seeing one version of it instead of understanding the full range of what it can actually look like. Now we're going to shift gears a bit. So far we've talked about differences in perception and imagination. Next we're going to move into movement, learning, and coordination differences. Let's start with dysgraphia. Dysgraphia is a learning disability that affects writing. It's not about intelligence or understanding. It's about the ability to physically write or organize thoughts on paper. This could look like having problems holding a pencil, difficulty writing in a straight line, writing letters in reverse, or not being able to recall how certain letters are formed. Imagine sitting in class and knowing exactly what you want to say. You have the answer in your head, but when you try and write it down, your hand won't cooperate. The letters don't come out the way you planned. Your spacing is off. You're erasing constantly. And while everyone else is finishing, you're still stuck on the first few sentences. From the outside, it might look like you're not trying, but in reality, you're putting in more effort than everyone else. And this is a good moment to pause, because from the outside, struggles like this often get labeled as being lazy or messy. But in reality, for people with dysgraphia, writing takes more effort, not less. This is less known about because people who have dysgraphia are often just labeled as sloppy or having bad handwriting. Dyslexia, which is similar to dysgraphia but with reading instead of writing, often overshadows dysgraphia. Dysgraphia can be diagnosed as a specific learning disability, though it often co-occurs with other conditions. There are different types of dysgraphia, including motor-based, language-based, and mixed. Some people struggle more with the physical act of writing, while others struggle with organizing their thoughts. Dysgraphia can significantly impact academic performance due to a lot of tasks in school focusing on writing. Now moving on to dyspraxia. Dyspraxia is also known as developmental coordination disorder. It affects movement and motor skills like writing or buttoning a shirt, and gross motor skills like balance, coordination, or sports. People with dyspraxia might feel out of sync in physical activities or have difficulty with coordination or spatial awareness. It can also affect planning, organization, and aspects of speech. Emotionally, this can be really impactful because these are everyday tasks most people don't think twice about, so when they're consistently difficult, it can affect confidence and self-esteem. Imagine having to think through movements that other people do automatically, something like walking through a crowded space, playing a sport, or even buttoning a shirt. That can take more time, focus, and coordination than people realize. And when it keeps happening, it's easy to start to feel out of sync with everyone else around you. Dyspraxia is less known about because to a lot of people, it just looks like being clumsy or not putting enough effort in. But it's a real neurological difference. Breaking down tasks into smaller, more manageable tasks can be incredibly helpful, as well as using visual aids and practicing motor tasks. Dyspraxia is often co-occurring with SPD, autism, and ADHD. Now let's talk about dyscalculia. Dyscalculia is a learning disability affecting the ability to understand information relating to numbers and math. But it's not just about math class. These difficulties translate into other things, like difficulties remembering sequences like dance steps, or difficulty with the cost of items, trouble reading clocks, telling time or how long something will take. Dyscalculia can translate into adulthood as well, with problems reading bills, calculating tips, and budgeting. A lot of people grow up thinking they're just bad at math, but for some, it's actually a difference in how their brain processes numbers. Imagine being in school and watching everyone else understand something that just doesn't click for you, no matter how hard you try. You study more, you practice more, and it still doesn't stick. Over time, you stop seeing it as this is difficult and you start seeing it as I'm just bad at this. And that label can follow you for years. It can show up in everyday life too, like struggling to read clocks, estimate time, or manage money, and constantly feeling like you're behind in ways other people don't even notice. Dyscalculia is less known about because we are very far behind in the research about dyscalculia, and there is limited awareness and research compared to other learning disabilities. Many people just think they are bad at math, and there's this association that math is hard for a lot of people. A lot of people just carry that label with them for years without even questioning it. They just assume it's a personal failure instead of a difference in how their brain works. As I describe these, you might already be recognizing some of them in yourself. Feel free to pause and reflect. Next, we're going to move into sensory and processing differences, which can impact how people experience the world around them in a very direct way. This is where things start to feel a lot more immediate because it's not just about how you think. It's about how you experience the world around you. Let's start with sensory processing differences, often referred to as SPD. SPD is when the brain processes sensory input differently, so things like sound, light, texture, or movement aren't being filtered or interpreted in the same way. Imagine walking into a room where the lights feel too bright, the sounds feel too loud, your clothes feel uncomfortable against your skin, and everything is hitting you all at once. It's not just distracting. It's overwhelming, like your brain doesn't have a volume control. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine needing more input just to feel regulated. You turn the volume up louder than other people would. You seek out strong textures, movement, or intense sensations just to feel balanced. That's the range people can experience. And if you remember in episode 2, I talked about hyper and hyposensitivity and how a lot of people are a mix of both depending on the situation, which is really important to understand. It's not about preference. It's about how the brain is actually interpreting sensory information. Differences in sensory processing can mean being oversensitive, which is also known as hypersensitive, or undersensitive, also known as hyposensitive, or a mix of both. Some people avoid sensory input, they would be sensory avoidant, and those who actively seek it out are sensory seeking. And this is important to understand. It's not about preference, it's about how the brain is interpreting sensory information. Sensory modulation disorder is when someone has difficulty regulating the intensity of sensory input and can be either under or over responsive to it. Hypersensitivity could look like being oversensitive to clothing, bright lights, or strong smells, and those who are hyposensitive want more sensory input such as spicy food or loud noises. Sensory discrimination disorder is difficulty in distinguishing between sensory stimuli. An example would be not being able to tell the difference between a car horn and a child's voice, or struggling to identify different textures. Sensory-based motor disorder is challenges with motor planning and coordination due to sensory input, which can cause challenges with balance and posture, and is often linked with dyspraxia, and it can cause difficulties in things like riding a bike or walking. Many people with autism and ADHD experience sensory processing differences, although it's not an official diagnosis in the DSM-5, which makes it hard to get a diagnosis. Anyone can experience sensory processing difficulties, not just autistic people and not just ADHDers. Now let's talk about auditory processing disorder, or APD. APD is not about someone being able to hear or not hear. It's about someone being able to process sound. Someone with APD can hear perfectly fine, but their brain has difficulties interpreting what they are hearing. This can look like struggling in noisy environments and needing things repeated often. And socially, this can be exhausting. Imagine asking people to repeat themselves or always feeling like you're a step behind in conversations. That can lead to embarrassment, frustration, and even social withdrawal. Imagine being in a conversation and hearing every word, but not being able to put them together fast enough to understand. By the time you process the first sentence, the person has already moved on. Now you're behind, trying to catch up, deciding whether to ask them to repeat it again or just pretend you understood. Over time, that can make conversations exhausting and even something you start to avoid. Now I will talk about misophonia. Misophonia is when certain sounds trigger strong emotional reactions. These sounds can be things like chewing, breathing, typing, or repetitive noises. The reactions to these noises can include anger, anxiety, disgust, or emotional overwhelm. And I want to slow down here for a second, because to someone who doesn't experience this, it may sound small, but for someone who does, it can be intense and unavoidable. It can impact relationships, shared spaces, and daily life. Misophonia can make it hard to be in shared spaces like a cafeteria or office. And it's not just that that specific sound is annoying. It's hearing a small repetitive noise and feeling your entire body react instantly. Your heart rate increases, your focus disappears, and all you can think about is getting away from that sound. And the hardest part is knowing that other people don't experience it that way. Misophonia is less known about due to the misunderstanding and due to it not being an official diagnosis. There's also limited research on it. Misophonia does have overlap with SPD. People with misophonia may be told that they are being too sensitive or too dramatic, which can lead to isolation and frustration, and it is often minimized by those who don't experience it. Sound therapy or noise-canceling headphones can help reduce exposure to trigger sounds and give people a sense of control over their environment. Now we're going to shift into language and communication differences, which can affect how people understand and express themselves. Now I'm going to talk about hyperlexia. Hyperlexia is when a child learns to read at a very young age, often before they can fully understand spoken language. At first glance, it might seem like an advanced skill, and in some ways it is, but it often comes with challenges in comprehension, communication, and social interaction. There are 3 different types of hyperlexia, but not all researchers follow or agree with these 3 types. Type 1 are neurotypical children who learn to read very early. Type 2 is associated with autism, which includes fascination with numbers and difficulties with social communication and repetitive behaviors. Type 3 looks similar to Type 2. Children are far above age level but have delayed spoken communication and show traits similar to autism, but they fade over time, and they have typical social communication skills. This is a really good example of something that can be both a strength and a challenge at the same time. Someone might be able to read complex words but not fully understand what they mean in conversation. Children with hyperlexia often have strong memory and pattern recognition, show intense interest in letters or numbers, and struggle with conversational tone or language. With the right support, they can build stronger communication skills over time. Personally, I strongly relate to hyperlexia, although I want to make it clear that I am not diagnosed with it, but I was always a super advanced reader, so much that people didn't believe it. Next, I will talk about developmental language disorder, or DLD, which is a condition that affects how someone understands and uses language. It starts in childhood, but it often continues into adulthood. This can impact understanding spoken language, forming sentences, using words in the right context, and following complex instructions. For example, someone might struggle with phrases like break a leg or with multi-step instructions. And I want to pause here for a moment, because from the outside, this can be easily misunderstood. People might assume someone isn't paying attention, isn't trying, or just isn't putting in the effort. But that's not what's happening. DLD is about how the brain processes language, not about effort or intelligence. Because of this, it's often misdiagnosed or confused with other conditions, especially since it overlaps a lot with things like ADHD and autism. That misunderstanding can lead to a lot of frustration, shame, and being unfairly labeled. DLD requires understanding, patience, and support. Next, I'll be talking about rejection-sensitive dysphoria, or RSD. Now, this is something I have mentioned in previous episodes. RSD is not an official diagnosis, but it is a term used to describe intense emotional sensitivity to perceived rejection, criticism, or failure. It's most commonly associated with ADHD, but not everyone with ADHD experiences it. For someone with RSD, the reaction to rejection is not just feeling a little hurt. It can feel overwhelming, immediate, and deeply painful. This can happen even if the rejection wasn't intentional or even real. Think about a moment where you felt rejected or criticized. Now imagine that feeling being amplified. That's what RSD can feel like. RSD can look like overthinking a small conversation for hours or even days, feeling extremely upset over small criticism, or avoiding situations where you might be judged or rejected. These reactions are not about being too sensitive or overreacting. They are connected to how the brain processes emotional experiences. RSD is often less talked about because it's not formally recognized as a standalone diagnosis, so many people don't realize there's a name for what they are experiencing. It's also frequently misunderstood and dismissed as anxiety, moodiness, or low self-esteem. Understanding RSD can be incredibly validating for people who have always felt like their emotional reactions were too much, when in reality, their brain is just processing things differently. Finally, I will be talking about acquired brain injury, or ABI. ABI refers to any brain injury that occurs after birth. This includes things like traumatic brain injuries, strokes, infections, or lack of oxygen to the brain. Unlike many of the other conditions in this episode, ABI is not something someone is born with. It's something that happens later and can change how the brain functions. ABI affects everyone differently depending on the severity of the injury, but it can impact memory, attention, language, problem solving, and emotional regulation. Imagine going through life one way, and then suddenly your brain doesn't work the same anymore. Things that used to feel automatic, like focusing, recalling information, or even having conversations, can become difficult or exhausting. And from the outside, people might not see that change at all. But internally, everything is different. And I think this is one of the clearest reminders of how much we take our brains for granted until something changes. ABI is often talked about less in neurodivergent spaces because it doesn't always fit into the typical idea of neurodevelopmental conditions. However, it still has a place here because it represents a difference in how the brain works, and it deserves recognition and understanding. ABI is an acquired neurological difference rather than a neurodevelopmental one that you are born with. Another reason ABI can be overlooked is because it's often invisible. From the outside, someone may be the same, but internally, they may be navigating significant cognitive or emotional changes. Recognizing ABI as part of the broader conversation around neurodivergence helps create a more inclusive understanding of what it means to have a brain that works differently. After all that, I want to include a sensory break. This time, I'm going to walk you through a simple grounding exercise. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So first, we will start with a deep breath. Then I want you to look around your environment, wherever you are, and name 5 things you can see, like the texture of a wall or the pattern of your clothing. 4 things you can feel, like the sensation of your feet on the ground or the warmth of the sun. 3 things that you can hear, like the hum of a fan or distant traffic. 2 things that you can smell. If you don't smell anything, you can think of some of your favorite smells. And 1 thing that you can taste. If you can't taste anything, you could think of some of your favorite tastes. Just like in episode 4, I want to tie all of these together by giving some everyday examples of each. Synesthesia could look like seeing specific colors when reading letters or numbers, like A always being red, or music triggering visuals, textures, or tastes. Aphantasia could look like being told to picture a beach and seeing nothing, just knowing the concept, or struggling with guided visualization exercises in school or therapy. This was a big one for me. When we did poetry in school, my teacher had the class do visualization to help understand, and I struggled so much. Tourette syndrome could look like repeated blinking, throat clearing, or shoulder movements you can't fully control. Dysgraphia could look like knowing exactly what you want to say, but struggling to get it onto the paper, avoiding writing even when you understand the material, or getting physically tired from writing tasks. Dyspraxia could look like feeling out of sync in sports or group physical activities, difficulty learning things like riding a bike or tying shoes. Dyscalculia could look like getting overwhelmed with directions involving distance or time, such as in 1 mile or 5 minutes away, or struggling to remember numbers like phone numbers or dates. APD could look like struggling to follow conversations in noisy environments and frequently asking people to repeat themselves. SPD could look like avoiding crowded or noisy places because they're overstimulating, or seeking out strong sensory input, or feeling overwhelmed by bright lights, loud noises, or certain textures. Misophonia could look like feeling guilty or confused about strong reactions to small sounds, needing to leave a room because of a specific repetitive noise. Hyperlexia could look like being able to read complex words or books, but not fully understanding the meaning, or reading at a very young age but not fully understanding the meaning. DLD could look like difficulty following long or complex verbal instructions, or struggling to find the right words in conversations. In this next section, I want to talk about why these conditions are overlooked in the first place. Because it's not that these conditions are rare, it's that the system wasn't built to recognize them. For a long time, research on neurodivergence was based on young boys. So that means the standard signs that we're taught to look for don't always reflect how these conditions show up in girls, women, or marginalized groups. Another major reason these identities are overlooked is masking. Another reason is that people get labeled instead of supported or understood. They are called lazy, unmotivated, too sensitive, or told they're just not trying hard enough. But these labels aren't explanations for what's happening. they are misunderstandings. Many of these identities also overlap with each other or with more well-known diagnoses. For example, someone with dyscalculia might be told they're bad at math, or someone with dyspraxia might be labeled as clumsy. Sometimes people are diagnosed with anxiety, autism, ADHD, or another condition when those diagnoses are actually the result of years of being misunderstood. People don't know what they've never been taught. If you don't have the language to describe something, it becomes so much harder to recognize it in yourself or others. So people go years, sometimes their entire lives, without understanding their own experiences. So if you've ever felt like something about the way your brain works was different, but you didn't have the words to explain it, it's not because you missed something. It might be because no one ever gave you that language in the first place. There are many myths that exist across all of these conditions. A very common myth is that any of these conditions are the result of laziness or not trying hard enough. But that's not true. Such as with dysgraphia and dyspraxia, people put a lot of effort into their work, but they struggle because of the way their brain processes, not because they aren't trying hard enough. Another myth is that these conditions only affect children, but that's not true. These are neurological or neurodevelopmental conditions, meaning the brain is wired differently, and your brain wiring doesn't change just because you've turned 18. The problem is, in adulthood, there's even more stigma and it can be even harder to get diagnosed. A myth similar to that is these things will get better with age, because oftentimes these conditions are diagnosed in childhood, but these are not things that get better just because you grow older. People with these conditions often need specific supports in order to succeed. Another point I want to touch on is how people outside of the neurodivergent community are so focused on trying to make things get better or cure them. With any neurological or neurodevelopmental condition, there's no cure. There's currently no way to change the underlying brain wiring associated with these conditions. There are supports that can help people thrive, but there isn't a cure or a way to fix or make these conditions better. But remember that it doesn't have to get better. Neurodivergent people can live great lives as long as they have the support and understanding that they need to thrive with their condition. And since this episode is going out in July, Disability Pride Month, it's a great time to talk about how disabled people can thrive. While there are struggles to being disabled, it can change your outlook on life and help you find community. Disability Pride Month is all about celebrating disabled people and our right to exist in communities, recognizing disability as a valid identity, understanding that disabled people don't need to be fixed to be included, accepted, or supported, and celebrating disabled joy and the pride of being disabled. A big part of Disability Pride Month is also recognizing that many of the barriers disabled people face come from systems and environments, not just the conditions themselves. Thriving doesn't mean that everything is easy. It means having understanding, support, and space to exist in ways that work for you. Another myth is that all conditions need therapy and they can be fixed with therapy. Therapy can be helpful, but therapy will not work for everyone, and therapy is not designed to fix anything. It's designed to help people manage, cope, and thrive with their unique ways of thinking and life. Not having a diagnosis doesn't mean your experience isn't real. You didn't miss it, the system missed you. Before I end this episode, I want to quickly recap everything we talked about and some terminology. Synesthesia is where multiple senses are crossed, like tasting colors or hearing shapes. Aphantasia is the inability to form mental images, and many live with it without knowing. Tourette syndrome is a tic disorder involving involuntary movements and vocalizations. It's often misunderstood, and media portrayals often focus on coprolalia. Dysgraphia is a learning disorder impacting writing. Dyspraxia is a neurodevelopmental condition affecting movement and coordination. Dyscalculia is a learning disorder impacting math. Sensory processing disorder is differences in processing sensory information. Auditory processing disorder is a struggle to process auditory information, not due to hearing, but due to not being able to process the information. Misophonia is where common sounds produce strong emotional reactions. Hyperlexia is reading at a young age but struggling with social communication and understanding language and what you are reading. Developmental language disorder is a communication disorder impacting how people understand and use language. ABI is any acquired brain injury that happens after birth. It is not something you are born with, but it still deserves to be recognized in this episode as part of the conversation of the broad nature of neurological conditions. Throughout this episode, I also debunked many common myths and stereotypes about these conditions. Now I want to end with some closing remarks. Throughout this podcast, we've been building an understanding of what it means to be neurodivergent. Your experiences are valid, whether your identity is commonly recognized or whether it is lesser known. Something important to remember is that these conditions don't exist in isolation. Many people experience multiple of these at the same time. Many of these diagnoses do not have enough research about them, and we need to raise awareness and advocate for more understanding. Having the right words for your experience can be life-changing. You're not alone in this, even if it feels like you are. If no one has given you the words for your experience before, I hope this episode helped you find them. If you have experience with any of these conditions, I would love to hear your stories, and also let me know if you are interested in hearing more about any of these. I can plan a full episode on any of these. Today's affirmation is, my experiences are real even if they are not widely understood. Today's question is, are there any neurodivergent identities you had never heard of before listening to this episode, and if so, which ones? In my next episode, I will be covering common misconceptions and stereotypes. Thank you for listening to this episode of Minds That Think Differently. Remember to contact me with any questions, comments, concerns, or interview questions at connect@thinkdifferentpod.com. And for full transcripts and more information on the podcast, please visit thinkdifferentpod.com.